Hi everyone, it's Willow from OutCenter, and you're watching a video in our series on a protocol for an inclusive future. We're breaking down a series of harmful worldviews, and today we're talking about toxic masculinity. We're doing a deep dive into its historical roots, its evolving forms, and how we can dismantle it. We face growing threats from toxic masculinity, Christian nationalism, and white supremacy. But we believe that there is a better path forward, found in inclusive communities, gender liberation and equality, and intersectionality. These principles offer a roadmap to a world where everyone can thrive. Learn more and get resources to be an advocate at outcenter.org/protocol. Let's clarify a term really quick: masculinity. This expression in of itself isn't necessarily toxic. The problem is what feminist scholar Bell Hooks calls patriarchal masculinity, which is a system that enforces emotional repression, dominance, and violence as markers of manhood while denying authenticity and connection. Judith Butler, a queer philosopher, has work on gender performativity, which tells us that these norms aren't natural. They're constructed, learned, and performed over time. But let's start with some basic history. This idea of patriarchal masculinity is not inevitable or natural. It's just a historical human invention. As historian Gerda Lerner documents, patriarchal dominance was codified in ancient Mesopotamia, where laws like Hammurabi's treated women like property. It subordinated their rights and positioned marriage as a tool of male control. The agricultural revolution in European and other Western countries accelerated the gender division. When agriculture became dominant, men worked the land and women's labor shifted to home and childcare. This division of labor cemented the foundation of a separate spheres way of thinking, splitting life into the public or male sphere and the private or female domain in the own home, doing their own thing, often, of course, away from politics or work. In other points of history, we see patriarchy adapt to local conditions. In medieval Europe, of course, where the influence of the church was strong, see our video on Christian nationalism. There were attempts to further limit the roles of women through requiring masculinity to be a part of clergy, to be parts of systems of authority, and idealized masculinity as heroism and chivalry, fighting in wars, things that women were often not allowed to do. Not that wars are great, but when a culture codes as particular things as masculine, it also codes those things as being centers of force, power, violence, and coercion. In the Industrial Revolution into the Victorian era, men became breadwinners and women were confined to often unpaid domestic labor. Victorian masculinity promoted stoicism, sexual dominance, and emotional suppression. These standards shaped mental health and family relationships, leading to lasting stress for men unable to fulfill such roles, or to fulfill them in the very specific way that society wanted them to. Let's revisit Bell Hooks. Hooks exposes how from childhood, boys are pressured to repress almost everything but anger. Even mothers can unconsciously act as agents or referees of patriarchy, teaching sons to be man enough or to man up by policing emotions and enforcing tough exteriors. Hooks says, to indoctrinate boys into the rules of patriarchy, we force them to feel pain and to deny their feelings. Learning to wear a mask is the first lesson in patriarchal masculinity. Have you heard this before? Boys don't cry, men don't cry. You've got to hide those emotions. That's a big part of what makes toxic masculinity toxic, right? When you can't express yourself and you bottle up emotions, how are you going to have the mental and emotional capacity to show empathy or compassion for others? But as Hooks points out, patriarchy is not just upheld by men, and not just by straight cisgender men too. Others can play roles in what we might call reproducing such a system. If sometimes we benefit from having these systems of control, it can be harder for us to question them or critique them. Despite the unhealthy nature of many of these systems, people who can stand to benefit from toxic masculinity, such as women whose husbands have coercive control because of it, or even cisgender gay men, it's harder for those people to separate themselves from a system, which again, though perhaps abusive in some other ways, still provides them with safety and comfort, either monetary or emotionally, through cultural capital or otherwise. But what Hooks points us to is a call to love men, and obviously everyone, simply for being, not for putting on a mask, not for holding back tears, not for being unempathetic, of course. And to accept people as they are liberates people from performing sexist and harmful roles, not just harmful for themselves, but also others, and embracing a feminist masculinity, one marked by emotional openness, partnership, and authenticity. Now let's talk about Judith Butler and their theory of gender performativity. Butler says that masculinity and femininity are not innate, but enacted through repeated culturally approved behaviors, language, and rituals. Gender is not something one is, it is something one does, as Butler says. And it's the repetition of these norms, dress, behaviors, relationships with one another that fashions our identities, how other people see us, how we see ourselves, and how that cycle works together, vice versa. Societies enforce performative gender norms that limit freedom. And as I mentioned, because of power. When people can perform in certain ways, this gives them the right, as it were, to speak louder in meetings, to demand unequal pay, go after other people's rights, for instance. I mean, look who most of the people are arguing against reproductive health care. But these scripts, since they are just arbitrarily performed and conditioned and repeated throughout cultures, well, guess what that means? They're not set in stone. They're not written in anybody's DNA. That means that we can change those things and perform something that's healthier. We talked about the history. We talk about these terms and critiques and how they emerge. But I want us to focus a little bit more on what we might consider this modern issue of toxic masculinity. In a lot of ways, there's a whole ecological set of issues why there has been this increase in masculine angst, you might say. Labor has shifted, so have relationships and gender roles. In terms of labor, it's harder for people to find jobs and work across various different spheres and things like that. So common social and economic factors of success, for good or bad, examined or unexamined, that sometimes men used to view themselves with respect or honor, well, those systems are down the drain when one can't even find jobs at fast food restaurants. There are also changes in relational dynamics. We've seen a shift, of course, from a world wherein women couldn't even open bank accounts unless they were married to a man. We've also seen the greater acceptance of LGBT people and marriage equality and so many things like that. Because culture has shifted from this privileged perspective of men who have not been critical towards themselves and the wider culture find themselves miles and miles behind from where they think they should be. And unfortunately, many of those toxic men view that as a problem with women and queer people and society, certainly not themselves. Some people call this a crisis. Well, obviously the problems in our hyper-consumeristic world are outside of any of our control. The response that toxic men have towards it by becoming incels, involuntary celibates, or joining the manosphere, hearing toxic men talk about how they're owed love and sex and how they should be alpha males, which are all these performative, unempathetic, harmful things, as if that's going to change the wider circumstances around them. And it especially won't change their hearts. Such anxieties are not socially, emotionally, or relationally helpful at all. Starting from a place of narcissistic presumption doesn't help anybody examine themselves, and it certainly doesn't help when those people who are unexamined and presumptuous engage with and interact with others. It's not going to be helpful when you start quoting Andrew Tate or Joe Rogan to try to make friends. But of course, then the cycle repeats. As people dig their heels deeper into these worldviews, we see that angst build up more and more and more. And it's the reason why we've seen in real life violence happen against women and queer people and just anybody else caught in the mix over or because of these incel or manosphere ideologies. But it's not just the Joe Rogans, Andrew Tates, Jordan Petersons, Matt Walsh's, J.D. Vances of the world that are promoting harmful ideologies about women and queer people needing to go away, women having no value other than being reproductive agents and things like that. And of course, we cannot forget how this particular issue, toxic masculinity, is connected with the other harmful worldviews like Christian nationalism and white supremacy. If you spent any time online, you've probably seen Christian nationalists appeal to the framing of the Crusades, which of course were a violent time, and there were a lot of people making very bad political mistakes that were based on violence. But the thing about Christian nationalism's links to things like the Crusades shows this reemergence of a medieval worldview, and I mean that in as critical of a way as possible. Or this idea that this masculinity requires oppression of others, conquering nations, and of course this idealized version of chivalry, which includes beating people up, wearing armor, and fighting others with swords as being the virtue. This, of course, is a very anemic worldview once more. And of course, when the incel worldview and the manosphere find their fuel in a religious justification. Just as Christianity has had a place of privileged supremacy in our country, so has whiteness. White supremacy relies on the myth of the superiority of white people, and it perpetuates racial and gender hierarchies. If there's a hierarchy with men and there's a hierarchy of Christians at the top, it also includes white folks at the top. And as I've mentioned before, people in positions of power don't like having that power questioned. And so when people are fueled by their race, they're fueled by their religion, and they're fueled by their gender as being sources and sites of power, we understand how these three things are like three rocket engines propulsing one towards this end that is focused on coercion. It's not focused on the good of other people. It's not focused on liberation, to be sure. By naming, analyzing, and challenging patriarchal norms, we create space for a liberated masculinity, one that can release people from this idea that if they're not the breadwinner, if they're not being an alpha or a sigma or whatever new term is important to them, that they're failing as a man or they're failing in masculinity. Challenging patriarchy includes realizing and understanding justice for all genders. That's through intersectional collective action. We see patriarchy rearing its ugly head, as we've pointed out, in the weak and cowardly escape from supporting trans kids, even by folks on the left, and then covering the position of power that they hold by making false claims and using cheap excuses and using moral bludgeons to hide behind the fact that by protecting trans kids, they will lose a position of power from their perspective. I don't think that that's true. We have counterfactuals that show that when people support trans kids loudly and openly, they're not losing their power. But again, that connects to this idea of toxic masculinity because it connects to power. All of these are part of an ecology of power. If gender and trans kids are not a thing to protect, who is going to be upheld in this particular perspective? Well, in our country, that default is toxic masculinity and patriarchy. And by not giving space for queer people, including trans kids, we're going to see more ground be ceded and handed over to people who hold a worldview of toxic patriarchy and masculinity. So what can we do? We can learn to recognize toxic masculinity, even if it's inconvenient for us. Even if protecting trans kids and people who are gender expansive and people who are not men and masculine in a particular cultural way, even if standing up for those people is not going to be the most helpful thing to our career, we need to do it anyways. And I do think that those of us who have a closer connection to power often find it most uncomfortable to question it. If you are a straight white male, you do have much more going for you. You're not going to be hurting from the gender pay gap. The same sort of privileged position can happen with cisgender gay men. The idea of the link to masculinity, and again, especially white gay men, includes so many ways for those people to have additional privileges that women, queer people, trans people, other folks do not. And so it's important for everybody to start thinking of ways that they can be critical towards this particular harmful worldview. Support healthy masculinity, support non-binary views of healthy ways of living into one's gender expression. Gender liberation and equality is what's going to break us free from this toxic worldview. What are you going to do to help usher in a worldview where everybody can be welcomed, no matter who they are or what their gender is or what their gender expression might be? If you are enjoying this content, please share it on social media. And if you want to keep this content going, please give us a gift at outcenter.org/donate.